time to both gain a better understanding of the present and to make better predictions about the future. If we consider, for example, one of the sea lions living off of the coast here in San Diego, that sea lion lives in a rich environment and encounters daily challenges and needs to take in information to overcome those challenges. For example, pretend for a second that you're the sea lion trying to catch a herring. Frozen in this frame, your decision about how to behave is very uninformed. You don't know whether the fish was swimming in a direct path, where it came from, or how it came to be here, making it very challenging to make an inference about what your best course of action for catching this fish should be. To best predict how to catch this fish, you're going to need to contextualize its behavior in time, but what context is important, and what structure underlying that behavior provides information about what's to come. To ask these questions, my PhD uses birdsong as a model, focusing on both how birdsong is temporally structured and how songbirds integrate that structured information to facilitate perception and behavior. To orient anyone who isn't used to seeing or thinking about birdsong, we usually visually represent birdsong as a spectrogram. On the x-axis you have time, on the y-axis you have frequency, and the color map represents the power at any given time and frequency. One of the primary advantages of birdsong is that birdsong elements tend to be very discrete, like the syllables shown here, and they also tend to be very stereotyped, like the two regions in blue, which have been labeled A, Q. They're also incredibly diverse. These are clips of example song from 3 species that come up in this talk. And what I want you to note is that bird songs are very spectrally complex and that they're very structured in time. For example, in the Bengalese finch song on the top, this C tends to follow this B in the song. So the major components of my PhD can be roughly broken down into 4 parts. Part 1, I develop a framework for characterizing and synthesizing arbitrary repertoires of animal communication, focusing on the songbird. Part 2, I use that framework to try to understand something about the sequential organization of birdsong. And then in Part 3, I develop a behavioral paradigm to understand how songbirds perceptually integrate temporal structure. And then finally, in the 4th part, I use the task from Part 3 to probe how sequential information is integrated in sensory regions of the songbird brain. So Part 1 starts with some methods for finding this structure. This section can be pretty much summed up in this slide. The first side of what I'm doing is built upon recent advances in dimensionality reduction. Using big libraries of birdsong segmented into individual units, here syllables, we can project those syllables into latent representations and try to use those to identify various forms of structure in our signal. The second side is generativity. We can sample from those low-dimensional latent representations to produce smoothly varying and ecologically relevant signals that we can play back to the birds in downstream tasks like behavioral and physiological experiments. So to provide some intuition, I'm going to provide some examples. The plot that I'm showing you here is a scattered plot where each point is a syllable of swamp sparrow song. The border around the outside is showing example syllables pointing to the region in this latent space that they occupy. And then the color represents which of 6 different communities produced that syllable of swamp sparrow song. So for example, this red cluster here corresponds to syllables produced uniquely by birds in the Adirondacks in New York, and the rainbow cluster over here is produced by all 6 of these different communities. Using the same unsupervised techniques, we can also pull out things like individual identity from identity calls across these different species, discrete vocalization types within individuals, and we can also look across species to identify broad phylogenetic differences in vocalizations. So for example, in this figure, I'm showing that mammalian vocalizations tend to be less well stereotyped than songbird vocalizations. So knowing that birdsong is comprised of discrete stereotyped syllables, we can use these methods to derive corpora of song and use them to try to understand something about the sequential structure underlying that song. So this brings us to part 2, where we ask what new information can we actually learn from that data. So now we have access to these large corpora of labeled bird songs using the technique that I just described, and so we can look into the sequential structure of those vocalizations. The way that I do that is by using information theory to measure the relatedness between song elements as a function of distance. What does that mean? So we have this sequence A, B, C, D, E here, where A is closer to B than it is to E, and we can measure relatedness. And basically what we find is that as distance between elements increases, relatedness is going to decrease. A is more related to B than it is to E, but the shape of how that relatedness decreases tells us something about the signal. So if we consider, for example, a sequence generated by a memoryless Markov model, which is just a sequence model dictated purely by the transitions between discrete elements, as we look further back in time, there are exponentially many states that could have led to the current one. So the relatedness decays exponentially. If we instead consider a sequence underlined by latent structure connecting disparate elements, here, this hierarchically generated sequence, the surface distance here is much longer than the latent distance connecting these two end elements in the sequence. And so as a result of that, the decay and relatedness is going to fall off over much longer timescales, here following a power law. So we use this general framework to try to understand the structure underlying birdsong in human speech, and we basically had three alternative hypotheses for what we expected this decay to look like. The first is this power law decay, which again is indicative of this hierarchical structure. The second is exponential decay, again indicative of Markovian or finite state organization. And then finally a combined decay of exponential and power law structure, which, without going into too much detail, the reason behind this third model is because in speech we know that phonological organization tends to be pretty Markovian, whereas syntax and discourse structure are much more hierarchical. And so basically what we observe is that with all these different data sets of both speech and birdsong, we find a combination of long and short range relationships. So in other words, evidence for both Markovian and hierarchical long range structure in these signals. So this is something we're starting to see generally come out of the computational ethology literature. Long-range statistical dependencies, which are thought to be indicative of deep hierarchical organization, are everywhere. We see it in the hours-long patterns of whale song and Drosophila behavior and zebrafish behavior, and even things like music and the human genomes. We see these long-range relationships. So in language, these long-range relationships are thought to be the result of hierarchical linguistic organization. One of my favorite quotes is this: "Thoughts and ideas are multidimensional and often concurrent, yet they can be expressed surprisingly well sequentially by the translation into language. This reduction of dimensions occurs naturally, but requires memory and necessitates the existence of correlation, e.g. in written text." So in other words, long-range relationships are the result of language being compressed into a sequential medium. So we can test this hypothesis with children's speech, because children's speech initially doesn't have that rich syntactic and semantic structure that adult speech has. Our first hypothesis is going to be that long-range dependencies, which would emerge developmentally alongside the production of these rich syntactic and semantic complex speech. And then an alternative hypothesis, however, is going to be that these long-range dependencies exist the whole time, which we see in other signals like whale song and fruit fly motility, which don't have these complex kind of semantic and syntactic structures. And so we tested these hypotheses using corpora of children's speech, starting at 6 months of age and going on through adulthood. And basically what we found are results that support that second model, that long-range dependencies are there throughout the production of speech. And I don't have time to present data here, but just to summarize, what we've learned in this section is that speech is composed of both long-range and short-range structure, that birdsong exhibits these similar long-range and short-range organizational principles, and that finally, developmentally, these long-range organizations that we see in children's speech exist prior to the production of complex syntactic structures, meaning that these long-range relationships that we observe in speech are not fully explained by syntactic or discourse structure in language, as has been previously suggested. So now we've established in the previous sections that birdsong belongs to a class of behavioral signals that holds non-trivial predictive information about future states. So the second half of my PhD now is asking what we do with that information, how our brains handle that information. So broadly, the question that I'm asking is how our expectations about the world shift our perceptions. For example, if I give you a predictable sequence of birdsong, your expectations are going to bias your perception of what occurs next. My question is how? An example to prime you for this paradigm is the perception of speech. The difference between the sounds duh and tuh vary along a single dimension voice onset time. You perceive these sounds mostly categorically. At some point in that duh to tuh continuum, you'll switch from hearing one sound and start hearing the other. So if we embed that sound in a word, like the continuum from dark to the noun-word tark, at some point you'll stop hearing dark and you'll start hearing tark. But that boundary is not constant. If we instead embed that sound in dask, which is a non-word, to task, which is a word, that boundary shifts because we expect to hear words like task and dark and not those non-words. So to summarize the task that I created to kind of reproduce that sort of general paradigm, I used the methods from part 1 to synthesize smoothly varying syllables of birdsong, and then I trained birds to classify them. And then finally, I add in sequential context, so a syllable that occurs before the classified syllable that holds predictive information about what the bird is going to expect to hear. And basically what I hypothesize is that we'll get that same sort of shift in perceptual boundary. And I can model that shift as Bayesian integration. And so to briefly summarize the results there, we do observe this hypothesized perceptual shift, which is again well accounted for by this Bayesian model. And so to summarize this section, I used the methods from part 1 to synthesize these smoothly varying syllables of birdsong. I trained the birds to categorize those syllables in the context of a sequential cue. And then finally, I observed that behavioral shifts occur based upon that context, and that shift can be well explained by Bayesian models of perception. And then finally, getting to the fourth part of my PhD, the final part, was trying to figure out what's going on in birds' brains while this perceptual shift is happening. So to summarize the paradigm, I took the paradigm from the last section and recorded from the auditory brain while birds were performing this task. And so for each trial, I could record individual neurons and their spiking activity across all of these different stimuli, the syllables and the morphs across syllable types. And so from those spiking responses, we can do things like derive neurometric functions. So for each of these different morphs, we can get a different neurometric function, and I can compare those neural responses to the behavioral responses, compare the psychometric to the neurometric functions. And basically what we find is that the neural responses and the psychometric responses match up very well. But what we're more interested in is how context biases perception. So the first thing that we find is that spiking responses are shifted as a function of that sequential cue. So that perceptual bias that we saw in behavior does instantiate in some way in these physiological responses. But what you're probably going to ask yourself is, does that neurometric function shift in the same way as the psychometric function did? And the answer is no. So the results, I think, however, are actually more interesting than that. And I don't have time to show any of that data, but to briefly provide the gist, what we find is that changes in neural responses actually reflect something more interesting, a shift in the likelihood. So basically, to summarize the physiology, we recorded populations of neurons during the behavioral task, and we found that there are these neural shifts reflecting contextual information, predictive contextual information. And basically what we think that is a reallocation of neural resources, sharpening perception in expected regions of stimulus space. So to summarize the whole PhD, we provide these 4 different sections: first characterizing and then quantifying sequential organization, and then creating a behavioral task and recording physiology, in which we find this sort of perceptual shift being reflected in neural responses. So with that, I'd like to thank first and foremost my advisor, Tim Gentner at UCSD, and also the rest of my lab, many of whom were involved in these experiments that I talked about. And finally, a big thank you to Bob Glushko, to the Glushko Prize Committee, and to CogSci for giving me the chance to present to you all of these different chapters that have culminated in my PhD. Thank you very much.
Okay, for those still in, let's have one last round of applause for the winners. And thank you very much for joining us for this year's Glushko Dissertation Prize Symposium.